What happens when the man who pulled you from the wreckage is the exact same monster who put you there? Welcome to Lizzy Mafia romance stories. Today, we enter a world of shattered trust, rusted steel, and a lethal blood debt. We are following a master mechanic and a syndicate boss bound together by a secret that can get them both killed. If you want high-stakes drama, intense enemies to lovers tension, and a romance that burns hot enough to melt an engine block, hit that subscribe button right now. The truth is hiding in the shadows, and we are about to drag it into the light. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The fog crept across the Drowned Piers like a shroud of gray wool, thick with the scent of salt and rot. Harper Vance adjusted the strap of her tool bag, the weight of it a familiar ache against her good shoulder. She'd spent the last hour hauling a crate of precision-machined pistons from a damp warehouse to the bed of her primer-gray Chevy C10. Each step sent a sharp twinge through her left scapula, a grim reminder of the night the world went black 2 years ago. She didn't mind the pain. It was the only thing that felt honest in this graveyard of rusted steel. She slammed the tailgate of the C10. The metal groaned, a protest of age and corrosion. "Just one more haul, girl," she whispered, patting the cold flank of the truck. "Then we get out of this mist." She reached for the cab door, her fingers brushing the handle, and for a second, she felt a surge of triumph. The job was done. She had the parts. She had her freedom. But the air changed. The sound of the tide against the pilings vanished, replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed against her eardrums. A pair of headlights cut through the gloom, twin daggers of white light. A matte black Jensen Interceptor rolled out of the fog, its engine a low, rhythmic growl that vibrated in Harper's chest. It stopped 10 feet from her bumper, blocking her only exit path. A man stepped out. He wore a charcoal gray suit, the fabric crisp despite the humidity. He didn't rush. He moved with the calculated grace of a predator who knew the trap was already sprung. His dark hair was short, styled with a precision that felt out of place among the barnacles and brine. A jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow, a white line against tan skin. Harper's hand went instinctively to her back pocket, fingers gripping the cold steel of her 12mm wrench. It wasn't a gun, but the weight of it gave her a flicker of hope. If she could just reach the man's knee, she could dash past him into the maze of shipping containers. "You've got something that belongs to me, Harper," the man said. His voice was a calm rasp. He didn't look at her face. His eyes remained fixed on the crate in her truck. "I bought these parts fair and square," Harper snapped. She felt the silver bullet casing in her pocket, a cold coin of trauma. She squeezed it. "The guy at the dock said the owner didn't want 'em." The man finally looked up. His gaze bore into hers, cold and unyielding. He pulled a gold coin from his pocket and began to flip it over his knuckles. Clink, clink, clink. "The guy at the docks is currently at the bottom of the basin," he said, "and those pistons are the heart of a machine you can't fathom." He took a step forward. Harper gripped the wrench, her knuckles white. She saw her opening, a slight tilt in his stance. She lunged, swinging the wrench with all the desperation of a cornered animal. For a heartbeat, she thought she had him. The metal arc neared his temple. Then, her shoulder screamed. A bolt of fire shot through her nerves, and her left arm locked. The wrench slipped from her numb fingers, hitting the concrete with a hollow ring. She stumbled, her momentum carrying her right into his reach. Thorne Vane didn't strike. He caught her wrists, pinning her against the rusted side of her truck. His eyes scanned her, stopping on the jagged scar peeking from her tank top. The coin in his hand froze. The arrogance in his posture flickered, replaced by a sudden, sharp recognition that turned the air thin. "That scar," he murmured, his voice losing its edge. "The night at the South Pier." Harper tried to pull away, but the fog seemed to swallow her strength. She looked into the eyes of the man holding her and realized he wasn't looking at a thief anymore. He was looking at a ghost. Chapter 2. The cold metal of the Chevy pressed into Harper's spine. Thorne didn't let go. His grip was firm, but lacked the bruising force of a man trying to cause harm. He smelled of expensive leather and gun oil, a scent that triggered a frantic pulse in Harper's throat. "Let go," she hissed, teeth grit against the throb in her shoulder. "You want the parts? Take them! Take the truck! Just let me go!" Thorne's eyes searched hers, intense and unreadable. He released her wrists and stepped back, though he kept his body between her and the open pier. "I can't do that," he said. He pulled a black leather notebook from his jacket. He didn't write in it, he just held it like a weapon. "There's a law in the syndicate, Harper, older than me. It's called the blood debt. If a person has already paid in blood to the house, they cannot be executed for a lesser crime." Harper frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I don't owe you anything. I don't know you." "You took a bullet from my men 2 years ago," Thorne said, his voice flat. "That bullet was meant for a traitor. You were collateral. You paid a debt you didn't owe. That means your life belongs to the code now. My code." A spark of hope flared. If his code meant he couldn't kill her, she just had to get out of his sight. She saw a gap between Thorne and the Jensen. She bolted. She ignored the scream of her nerves and lunged for the pier's edge, hoping to lose him in the shadows of the nearby crane. She felt the wind on her face, the taste of freedom just a few yards away. She didn't get 5 steps. Her boots slipped on a patch of black algae. She went down hard on her left side. The impact sent a white-hot spear through her chest. The world tilted. She gasped for air, her lungs refusing to expand. She lay in the grime, watching the fog swirl above her, unable to move. Thorne was over her in seconds. He didn't haul her up roughly. He knelt in the salt grime, his charcoal suit ruining in the muck. He slid an arm under her knees and another behind her back. "Don't touch me," Harper wheezed, but her body was a traitor. She lacked the strength to push him away. "You're going to kill yourself trying to run," Thorne said. He stood up, lifting her with an ease that spoke of hidden power. He walked toward the interceptor. "Where are you taking me?" she managed to ask as he lowered her into the passenger seat. The leather was soft, smelling of cedar. "You're a mechanic, Harper. You fix things that are broken," Thorne said, his gaze fixed on the road ahead as he climbed into the driver's seat. He started the engine. The roar filled the cabin, a low-frequency hum that made the silver casing in Harper's pocket vibrate. "I have an engine that won't start. You're going to fix it. That's how you pay the rest of what you owe." He threw the car into gear. As they sped away, Harper looked back at her rusted Chevy C10, left behind in the fog with its tailgate open. She felt like she was leaving her soul in that parking lot, but the fear in her chest grew as she realized Thorne wasn't just taking her to a workshop. He was taking her to a fortress she might never leave. Chapter 3. The Jensen Interceptor climbed the steep, winding roads away from the coast, the salt air giving way to the scent of pine and damp earth. They reached a massive iron gate nestled in a cliffside. It opened silently, sliding on well-oiled tracks. Thorne drove into a sprawling compound that looked more like a fortress than a home. He parked in front of a structure of glass and steel, a garage that dwarfed Harper's entire shop back in the wards. He helped her out of the car, his hand hovering near her waist but not touching. He led her inside. The interior was a cathedral of machinery. Banks of high-end tools lined the walls, each one clean and in its place. In the center of the room sat a beast of a car, covered in a heavy gray tarp. The air was cool, filtered by a high-tech ventilation system. "This is where you'll stay," Thorne said, gesturing to a small loft area above the workbench that held a cot and a small desk. "Everything you need is here. Tools, parts, food." Harper walked to the center of the room. She reached out and pulled back a corner of the tarp. Beneath it lay a vintage Grand Tourer, its body stripped to the primer, its engine bay a hollow cavern of wires and disconnected hoses. For a moment, her fear receded. This was a masterwork. To touch this engine was a dream she'd never dared to have. She felt the weight of a wrench in her mind, imagining the spark of the cylinders. "What happened to it?" she asked, her voice softer. "It's a ghost," Thorne said, leaning against a pillar. He pulled out his gold coin. Clink, clink. It was built for a man who didn't want to be found. It's got a custom block, triple carbed, with an experimental fuel sink. It hasn't breathed in 10 years. Harper ran a grease-stained finger over the fender. You want me to bring a ghost back to life? I want it to run by the end of the month, Thorne said. If it does, you go back to your shop. I'll even fix your truck. Harper turned to him, her eyes narrow. And if I can't? Thorne didn't answer. He walked toward the heavy steel door. There's a fridge in the corner. Eat. Sleep. Start tomorrow. Wait! Harper shouted. You can't just lock me in here. Thorne paused at the door. He looked back, his face a shadow. I'm not locking you in to keep you here, Harper. I'm locking the world out. My men don't like outsiders, especially ones who know my face. He stepped out, and the door shut with a heavy, mechanical thud. Harper ran to the door and pulled the handle. It didn't budge. She was in a cage, no matter how much gold was on the walls. Then, the lights cut out. The silence of the garage became a physical weight. The shadows stretched and grew, creeping down the walls like ink. Harper's breath hitched. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the darkness pressed in on her. She reached for her belt, but her flashlight wasn't there. She'd left it in the truck. She slumped against the cold tire of the car, her eyes wide, staring into a blackness that felt like it was swallowing her whole. Chapter 4. The night was a long, shivering blur. Harper stayed curled against the tire of the car, her back against the rubber, waiting for a light that didn't come. Every time the building settled, the creak of metal sounded like a footstep. She didn't sleep until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the high, reinforced windows. She woke with a stiff neck and a thirst that felt like swallowing sand. She found the fridge Thorne mentioned, stocked with bottled water and fruit. She drank 2 bottles of water in silence, her eyes tracking the shadows that still lingered in the corners of the garage. She needed to see what she was working with. She reached for the light switch near the main bay doors. Nothing happened. She flipped it again. The overhead fluorescence flickered but stayed dark. Great, she muttered. $1 million garage and the fuse is blown. She searched the workbench until she found a heavy black aluminum flashlight. She clicked it on, the beam cutting through the dust motes. She began to hunt. She found the main breaker panel behind a stack of tires. It was an old-style fuse box, the kind that used glass cylinders. 2 of them were scorched black. She spent 2 hours tracing wires. She found a frayed cord on an old drill press that had sparked against the metal casing. She wrapped it in electrical tape, then searched the tool drawers for replacement fuses. She found a box of them in the back of a cabinet. She replaced the fuses and flipped the breaker. The garage surged to life, the overhead lights humming with a steady blue-white glow. She felt a surge of competence. She wasn't just a prisoner, she was the master of this machine. She could do this. She could win her way out. She moved to the car and pulled the tarp completely off. It was a beautiful, broken thing. She spent the afternoon in a rhythmic trance of teardown. She pulled the manifold, her movements slow and careful to avoid straining her shoulder. She laid each bolt out on a magnetic tray, labeled and organized. As she reached the core of the engine, she stopped. She held the flashlight over the block, her breath catching. The fuel sink, the experimental heart Thorne had described, wasn't just broken, it was gone. In its place was a gaping hole in the block, the mounting brackets sheared off as if someone had ripped the part out with a crowbar. "It's not a ghost," she whispered, her stomach dropping. "It's a corpse." She sat on the floor, surrounded by parts. Without that core, the car was a paperweight. She'd spent all day fixing the lights and the wires, only to find the one thing she couldn't fix. The sound of the deadbolt sliding back echoed through the space. Harper stood up, clutching a wrench, but her hands shook. Thorne walked in, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood 2 men with cold eyes and hands resting on their belts. "Progress?" Thorne asked, ignoring the men behind him. Harper pointed a trembling finger at the empty engine block. "You lied to me, Thorne. You didn't want a mechanic. You wanted a miracle. This engine is dead. and I think you knew it the whole time. Chapter 5. Thorne stepped into the garage, his presence instantly shrinking the room. He carried a paper bag that smelled of grilled meat and salt. He looked at the garage, now brightly lit, and then at the car, which Harper had dismantled into 100 organized pieces. "You've been busy," he said, placing the bag on the edge of the workbench. "The power was out," Harper said, not looking at him. She was scrubbing grease from her hands with a rag. "Your drill press is a fire hazard. I fixed it." Thorne walked to the engine bay. He looked at the empty space where the fuel sink should have been. "And the car?" "It's a hunk of metal, Thorne. The core is gone. You didn't tell me I was building an engine from scratch." She threw the rag down. It hit the floor with a wet thud. "I can't fix what isn't there. I'm a mechanic, not a magician. You dragged me here for a job that can't be done." Thorne pulled out his gold coin. Clink! "The core is being moved from a secure location. It arrives in 3 days. Until then, you prep the rest. I don't pay for excuses." "Prep what? The block is scarred. The brackets are sheared." She stepped into a space, her eyes blazing. "Who did this to the car? This wasn't a breakdown. This was a hit. Someone wanted to make sure this thing never moved again." Thorne's gaze darkened. "A man who thought he could take what was mine. He was wrong." "Is that what I am to you? Another part of your collection?" Harper's voice rose, fueled by the frustration of the night and the throbbing in her arm. "You think because you saved me from a bullet your men fired, you own me? You're just a man in a fancy suit playing God with people's lives." Thorne stepped closer. The air between them felt charged, a static tension that made the hair on Harper's arms stand up. "I don't play God, Harper. I play the hand I'm dealt. You were dealt a bad hand 2 years ago. I'm giving you a way to play it out. You could be back in that gutter, or you can be here, fixing the fastest car in the district." "By locking me in a box?" "By giving you a purpose," Thorne said. He reached out, his hand stopping just inches from the scar on her shoulder. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. "Your father was a drunk who sold your tools for a fix. Your shop was a front for a 2-bit gang. You had nothing but that rusted truck and a talent you were wasting on oil changes." Harper flinched as if he'd slapped her. "Don't you talk about my father." "I know exactly who he was," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know he's the reason you were at the piers that night. He owed a debt, too, didn't he? He traded your safety for a bag of white powder." Harper backed away, her heart hammering. "He's gone. It doesn't matter." "It matters to me," Thorne said. He turned and headed for the door. "Eat the food. It's from the deli on 4th. They use real brisket." "Thorne!" she called out. He stopped, his hand on the lever. "Why this car? Why now? If you're so powerful, why do you need a girl from the wards to fix a ghost?" Thorne looked back over his shoulder. For a split second, the coldness in his eyes cracked, revealing a deep, roiling exhaustion. "Because I need to leave this city, Harper. My own people are turning, and this is the only thing fast enough to get us both out alive before the storm breaks." He didn't wait for her response. The door slammed shut, and the deadbolt clicked into place. Harper stood in the center of the bright, cold room. He'd said, "us." The man who had shot her was now claiming her as his only hope for survival, and the weight of that realization felt heavier than any engine block she'd ever lifted. Chapter 6. The intake manifold sat on the workbench like a 60-pound slab of spite. Harper stared it down, her breath hitching in the quiet of the garage. To get the block ready for the fuel sink, she had to clear the top end. She reached for the iron component, her right hand sure, her left trembling. She knew the rules of her own body. She knew the exact angle that sent her nerves into a tailspin. She braced her feet against the grease-stained concrete. "Come on," she grunted. She heaved. The metal groaned as it broke the seal of old gasket gunk. A surge of triumph flooded her chest. She had it. She was stronger than the debt. She began to pivot, intending to set the manifold on the secondary table. Then came the sound, a sickening pop in her left joint. The world blurred into a haze of white heat. The manifold slipped. Harper gasped, her knees buckling as she tried to catch the weight with her good arm. She didn't want the iron to crack on the floor. She couldn't afford to lose more time. She strained, her face contorting, the muscle in her neck corded with effort. She managed to guide the piece onto the table's edge just as her strength vanished. "You're a fool." Thorne's voice came from the shadows by the hoist. He didn't sound angry, he sounded weary. He stepped into the light, discarding his charcoal suit jacket on a nearby stool. He wore a white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with scars and ropey muscle. "I had it," Harper wheezed, clutching her shoulder. She backed away, her pride stinging more than the injury. Thorne didn't argue. He walked to her, his movements fluid and predatory. He didn't stop until he was inches away. He smelled of rain and dark coffee. Before she could protest, he reached out. His large hand didn't grab. It slid behind her neck, his thumb resting just under her jaw. His other hand went to her injured shoulder, his touch surprisingly warm through the thin fabric of her tank top. "Don't," she whispered, though she didn't pull away. "Stay still," he commanded. He began to knead the muscle with a firm, practiced pressure. He knew exactly where the knot was. Harper felt the tension drain out of her, replaced by a heat that had nothing to do with pain. She looked up at him, caught by the way his dark eyes softened in the dim light. For a second, he wasn't a Don. He was just a man who knew what it felt like to be broken. The moment stretched, the air thick with the scent of oil and something more intimate. Thorne's gaze dropped to her lips. His thumb traced the line of her throat, a slow, deliberate caress. Harper's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wanted to lean in. She wanted to forget the piers and the bullets. His hand tightened slightly, then he pulled back. The cold air rushed between them like a slap. Thorne stepped toward the manifold and hoisted it onto the center of the table with one hand. "Go to the loft," he said, his voice back to a cold rasp. "I'll bring ice. If you touch another wrench tonight, I'll weld the tool chest shut." Harper watched him walk away, her skin still tingling where he'd touched her. She climbed the stairs to her cot, her mind a mess of confusion. She'd found a flicker of mercy in his hands, but as she looked down at him from the loft, she saw him staring at the door. He wasn't looking at the car anymore. He was watching for shadows. Chapter 7. The Ice Pack. Thorne brought was wrapped in a clean linen cloth. He'd left it on the small desk in the loft without a word, but the scent of his cologne lingered on the fabric. Harper lay on the cot, watching the moon cut a silver path through the high, reinforced windows of the garage. She was almost asleep when the first crack echoed through the compound. It wasn't a firecracker. It was the sharp, distinctive snap of a high-caliber rifle. Harper bolted upright, her heart leaping into her throat. Below, the garage was a cavern of shadows. She saw Thorne move before she heard him. He was a blur of charcoal and steel, sliding behind the Jensen Interceptor. He had a handgun in his grip, the barrel reflecting the moonlight. "Stay down!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the silence. The high windows shattered. Shards of glass rained down like diamonds, bouncing off the hoods of cars and the concrete floor. Harper scrambled back, pressing her spine against the brick wall of the loft. The sound of tires screaming against asphalt rose from outside the gate. A volley of bullets chewed into the steel siding of the garage, the thud-thud-thud sounding like a giant hammer. "Thorne!" she screamed. "I said stay down!" He rose from behind the car, firing 3 rhythmic shots through the broken window. A scream from outside suggested he hadn't missed. He moved with a terrifying, cold efficiency. He wasn't the man who had massaged her shoulder. He was a dealer of death. A flashbang grenade rolled through the shattered glass, bouncing once before it exploded in a blinding white glare. Harper shielded her eyes, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. She heard the main bay doors groan as something rammed them from the outside. The metal buckled, the hinges screaming. Thorne was at the base of her stairs in 3 strides. He grabbed her hand, pulling her down the steps as the doors finally gave way. A black SUV surged halfway into the garage, its headlights blinding. "Into the pit!" Thorne yelled. He shoved her toward the mechanic's trench, the narrow concrete crawlspace under the main hoist. Harper tumbled into the dark, damp hole. Thorne dropped in after her, his body shielding hers as the SUV's doors flew open. Men with submachine guns poured out, their boots thudding on the concrete. The smell of burnt powder and exhaust filled the space. "Vane!" a voice boomed, echoing off the walls. "Give us the girl in the car, and we might let you bleed out in peace." Thorne pressed his forehead against Harper's. In the cramped, dark trench, she could feel the heat of his skin and the frantic beat of his heart. He reached into his pocket and pressed something cold into her hand. It was the gold coin. "If they get to the edge of this pit," he whispered, his eyes burning into hers, "I want you to run for the back fuse box. Blow the main line. Don't look back." He didn't wait for her to agree. He surged out of the trench, a roar of defiance on his lips, leaving Harper alone in the dark with nothing but a coin and the sound of war. Chapter 8. The silence that followed the carnage was worse than the noise. It took Harper 10 minutes to find the courage to crawl out of the trench. The garage was a wreck. The SUV had retreated, leaving a trail of oil and shattered glass. The smell of copper hung heavy in the air, the smell of fresh blood. She found Thorne sitting against the Jensen's rear tire. His white shirt was soaked red on the left side, and his face was pale. He held a rag to a gash on his temple. Around him lay 3 men, unmoving in the gloom. "Thorne!" she gasped, rushing to his side. She forgot her own shoulder. She forgot her fear. "I told you to run!" he wheezed. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out. "Shut up!" Harper snapped. She knelt beside him, her hands moving with a mechanic's precision. She ripped a strip from her own tank top, exposing the scar on her shoulder without a second thought. She needed to stop the leak in his side. "You're bleeding too," Thorne noted, his voice fading. Harper looked down. A shard of glass had sliced her forearm during the tumble into the pit. She ignored it. She pressed the cloth against his ribs. Thorne let out a jagged breath, his head falling back against the tire. He didn't fight her. He let her work, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her hands shake. "Why didn't you hand me over?" she asked, her voice low. "You said I was a debt. You could have traded me for peace." Thorne reached out with a bloody hand, his fingers brushing the hair back from her forehead. "I don't trade what's mine, Harper." The word mine sent a jolt through her. She finished the bandage, tying it tight. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a crushing exhaustion. She looked at her arm, the cut finally starting to sting. Thorne took her hand. He didn't say anything. He just pulled her closer until she was sitting beside him against the tire. He took the rag from his temple and began to wipe the blood and grime from her arm. He moved with a tenderness that didn't belong in this world. He cleaned the cut on her forearm, his touch light, his breath warm against her skin. "We need to clean this up," she said, looking at the glass and the bodies. "The salt air will ruin the engine if it gets in through those windows." "Tomorrow," Thorne murmured. He didn't let go of her hand. He leaned his head against hers, their breathing falling into a shared, ragged rhythm. Harper looked at the shattered windows and the ruined door. The gilded cage was broken, but as Thorne's fingers laced through hers, she realized the walls weren't what were keeping her there anymore. She was bound to him by something far more dangerous than a debt. She fell asleep against his shoulder, the gold coin still tucked into her palm. Chapter 9. 3 days later, the garage felt like a tomb. Thorne had boarded up the windows with plywood, and the lack of natural light made the space feel smaller. He moved with a limp, his sides stitched up and bandaged. They didn't talk about the night of the attack, but the air between them had shifted. It was no longer a battle, it was a partnership. A heavy crate arrived at dawn, delivered by a man who didn't speak and drove an armored van. Thorne signaled Harper to open it. She used a crowbar to pry the lid off. Inside, nestled in high-density foam, sat the fuel sink. It was a masterpiece of chrome and brass, an intricate heart for a ghost. Harper felt a thrill of excitement. This was the final piece. She lifted it out, but as she brought it to the engine bay, she stopped. She held the sink against the mounting brackets. Her heart sank. "It doesn't fit," she said, her voice flat. Thorne walked over, peering into the bay. "What do you mean?" "This core is for a later model. The bolt patterns are off by 3 millimeters, and the intake port is circular. My manifold is oval." She set the part on the workbench. "I told you, Thorne, this engine is custom. You can't just swap parts." Thorne looked at the part, then at Harper. "Can you make it fit?" "I'd have to machine the housing. I'd need a lathe and a precision drill press." She looked at the tools she'd fixed. "And I'd have to do it by hand. If I'm off by a hair, the engine will explode the moment you hit the ignition." "Then don't be off by a hair," Thorne said. He stepped behind her, his chest brushing her back. He reached around her, his hands covering hers on the cold chrome of the sink. "I trust your hands, Harper. I've seen what they can do." Harper felt the heat of him, the steady strength in his arms. She leaned back, just for a second, letting him take her weight. "Why do you trust me? I have every reason to ruin this car." "Because you can't stand to see something broken stay that way," Thorne whispered into her ear. "It's who you are." He stepped away, leaving her cold. Harper picked up a scribe and began to mark the metal. She worked for 12 hours straight. The lathe hummed, throwing tiny curls of silver onto the floor. She ignored the ache in her shoulder and the throb in her cut arm. She was a surgeon, and this was her patient. Thorne stayed with her. He didn't help, he knew he couldn't, but he brought her water, he held the light when she needed it, and he watched her with a silent, growing respect. By midnight, the part was ready. Harper slid the sink onto the brackets. It clicked into place with a sound that felt like a victory. She tightened the bolts, her breath held. "Try it," she said, stepping back. Thorne climbed into the driver's seat. He turned the key. The starter whined, a high, lonely sound. It coughed, once, twice. Then, the engine roared to life. The sound was a physical blow, a deep, guttural growl that shook the tools on the walls. Harper laughed, a bright, genuine sound. She turned to Thorne, her face lit with joy. He was looking at her, a rare, genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He looked younger, lighter. He climbed out of the car and caught her by the waist, swinging her around. The triumph was a high they both rode, a moment of pure, unadulterated success. But as Thorne set her down, his hands lingered on her hips. The smile faded, replaced by a heat that made Harper's breath catch. He leaned in, his lips inches from hers. "You did it," he breathed. "We did it," she corrected. The kiss was inevitable. It was desperate and tasted of salt and grease. It was the high she'd been waiting for, a moment where the world outside the garage didn't exist. But as Thorne pulled her closer, his hand brushed the sun visor of the car, knocking a small, yellowed slip of paper to the floor. Chapter 10. The roar of the engine was a physical force, a primal scream that shook the very foundations of the garage. Harper felt the vibration through the soles of her boots, a rhythmic thrum that matched the frantic beat of her own heart. The air turned sharp with the scent of high-octane fuel and scorched dust, a smell that usually meant work, but tonight it felt like victory. She looked at Thorne, and for the first time, the mask of the ruthless dawn was gone. His eyes caught the blue-white glare of the overhead lights, sparkling with a boyish wonder that stole her breath. He didn't say a word. He stepped toward her, the distance between them vanishing in 2 strides. His hands, still stained with the silver shavings of the lathe, found her waist. He lifted her off the concrete, swinging her in a slow circle. Harper laughed, a bright, genuine sound that cut through the mechanical growl of the car. When he set her down, his grip didn't loosen. His thumbs traced the line of her hips, and the triumph in his gaze shifted into a heat that made the garage feel 10 degrees hotter. "You did it, Harper," he breathed, his voice a low vibration. "You brought the ghost back." "We did it," she corrected, her voice barely a whisper. She reached up, her fingers grazing the stubble on his jaw. The tension that had been building between them since the piers snapped like a frayed cable. Thorne leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that tasted of salt, grease, and desperation. It wasn't the kiss of a captor and a prisoner. It was a collision of two broken things trying to weld themselves back together. As Thorne pulled her closer, his shoulder brushed against the sun visor of the Jensen. The old leather creaked, and a small, yellowed slip of paper fluttered down, dancing on the air before landing on the floor between them. Harper pulled back, her chest heaving. She looked down at the paper. It wasn't a receipt. It was a photograph, the edges curled and stained by years of salt air. She reached down, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The world went silent. In the photo, a younger Thorne stood on the edge of the South Pier. He wore a black tactical vest, a sleek handgun gripped in his right hand. Behind him, the fog was a thick, sickly gray, but the flare of a nearby crane illuminated a primer gray truck. Her truck. In the driver's seat, a girl was screaming, her face a mask of terror. Next to Thorne stood a man with a frantic, greedy look in his eyes, her father. He was clutching a bag of white powder, his thumb hooked into the strap of a duffel bag. Harper's eyes tracked to the timestamp at the bottom. It was the night of the raid, the night her life ended. She looked at the gun in Thorne's hand, then at the silver bullet casing she always carried in her pocket. The caliber was a perfect match. "You were there," she whispered, her voice a jagged shard of glass. She looked up at him, the heat in her veins turning to ice. "You weren't just a witness, you were part of it." Thorne didn't move. The mask slammed back into place, cold and impenetrable. "Harper, put the photo down." "My father sold me out," she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow to the stomach. "And you were the one holding the gun. Did you pull the trigger, Thorne? Did you look me in the eye before you fired?" "I was protecting the perimeter," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a dead, flat tone. He didn't deny the gun. He didn't deny the night. He reached for the photo, but Harper backed away, her boots crunching on the glass shards from the earlier attack. "You didn't save me because of some code," she spat, tears of rage blurring her vision. "You kept me here to make sure I never remembered your face. You didn't give me a purpose. You gave me a cage to hide your own sin." She turned and ran for the stairs of the loft, the photo clutched in her hand like a weapon. Thorne didn't follow. He stood by the roaring engine, a shadow in the bright light, as Harper reached the top and slammed the small wooden door, locking herself into the dark. Chapter 11. The loft was a cramped, suffocating space. Harper sat on the edge of the cot, the only light coming from the moon through the high, barred window. She held the photo to the silver light, tracing the outline of her father's face. He traded her life for a bag of poison, and Thorne Vane had been the executioner's hand. The betrayal felt like a heavy weight on her lungs, making every breath a struggle. Below, the engine finally cut out. The silence that followed was worse than the roar. She heard the steady, rhythmic clink, clink, clink of Thorne's gold coin. He was waiting. "Harper!" His voice drifted up from the garage floor, echoing off the steel beams. "Come down. We need to talk about the drive." "Go to hell!" she shouted back. She gripped the silver casing in her hand until the metal bit into her palm. "I'm not fixing anything else for you. I'm not your mechanic, and I'm definitely not your mine." The sound of boots on the wooden stairs made her bolt to her feet. She looked around for a weapon, but she'd left her tool bag below. She grabbed a heavy glass water bottle from the desk, bracing herself. The door creaked open. Thorne stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking out the light from the garage. He didn't look like a Don. He looked like a man haunted by the very ghost he'd asked her to fix. "The raid was a mess, Harper," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Your father was a middleman for a cartel that was moving into my territory. He was supposed to hand over the ledger, not bring his daughter to a war zone." "He didn't bring me," Harper snapped, her voice trembling. "I followed him because I knew he was in trouble. I thought I could save him, and you shot me." "I fired at the man who was holding a knife to your father's throat," Thorne said, stepping into the room. The smell of cedar and coffee followed him, a scent that now made her stomach churn. The wind caught the round. It was a fluke, a mistake. A mistake that cost me 2 years of my life! She threw the water bottle. It shattered against the doorframe, splashing water across his white shirt. Thorne didn't flinch. He didn't move. "I spent those 2 years looking for you," he said. "I tracked every shop, every hospital, every gutter in the wards. Why do you think your shop stayed open as long as it did? Who do you think paid the protection money to keep the gangs away from your door?" Harper froze. The shop. The mysterious investor who had cleared her father's gambling debts a month after the shooting. She'd thought it was a stroke of luck. "You? I couldn't give you back your shoulder, Harper, but I could keep you safe." He took another step, his eyes searching hers in the dark. "The photo was in the visor because I never wanted to forget what I owed you. I kept it as a reminder of the cost of my world." "You lied," she whispered. "Every word about the blood debt was a lie to make me feel like I owed you." "It wasn't a lie. You did pay in blood. My blood." Thorne reached out, his hand stopping just short of her face. "Tomorrow we take the car out. We test the sink. If it holds, I take you wherever you want to go. No debts, no cages, just you and the road." He turned and left the loft before she could respond. Harper sank back onto the cot, the silence of the room pressing in on her. He was still the man who held the gun, but the shadow of the truth was far more complex than the darkness she'd been living in. Chapter 12. The morning air in the compound was crisp and carried the scent of wet pine. Thorne had opened the main bay doors for the first time since the attack. The sun hit the Jensen interceptor, turning the matte black finish into a deep obsidian sheen. Harper stood by the passenger door, her tool bag slung over her good shoulder. She checked the engine 3 times. Every bolt was torqued. Every fluid level was perfect. "Ready?" Thorne asked. He'd swapped his suit for a dark Henley and jeans, a look that made him seem more human and somehow more dangerous. "Let's get this over with," Harper said, climbing into the seat. They drove out of the compound, the engine singing a low, powerful song. The road was a private ribbon of asphalt that wound through the cliffs, overlooking the churning gray waters of the basin. Thorne pushed the car, the needle on the speedometer climbing steadily. 50, 70, 90. The fuel sink Harper had machined hummed perfectly, the transition between gears as smooth as silk. "She's perfect," Thorne said, a flash of pride in his eyes. He looked at Harper, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "You're a genius, Vance." Harper didn't smile back. She watched the road, her hand gripping the door handle. "Just drive the car, Thorne." They reached the straightaway at the top of the ridge. Thorne shifted into fifth, the car lunging forward like a hound off a leash. The wind roared past the windows, a sound of pure freedom. For a moment, Harper felt it. The thrill of the machine, the power of something broken made whole again. She looked at Thorne, and for a split second, the anger in her chest softened. Then, the car shuddered. A high-pitched whine started in the rear of the car, followed by a sharp ping that sounded like a snapped cable. Thorne's expression shifted instantly from pride to alarm. He tapped the brake pedal. It went straight to the floor. "Thorne?" Harper asked, her voice rising. "Brakes are out," he said, his voice tight. He pumped the pedal. Nothing. He pulled the emergency brake. It snapped in his hand, the cable having been pre-cut. "Sabotage," Harper whispered, her blood running cold. The road began to curve sharply toward the cliff edge. Thorne fought the wheel, trying to use the transmission to slow them down, but the engine was too powerful, the momentum too great. The car fishtailed, the back end sliding toward the guardrail. "Hold on!" Thorne shouted. Harper closed her eyes, clutching the silver casing in her pocket. She heard the scream of tires and the sickening crunch of metal on metal. The car smashed through the rusted guardrail, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of gray sky and dark water as they launched into the void. Chapter 13. The world didn't end in fire. It ended in a bone-jarring impact that sent a shockwave through Harper's entire body. The Jensen didn't tumble into the sea. It slammed into a massive sand pile left by a construction crew working on the lower cliff road. The sand acted as a giant cushion, swallowing the front end of the car and arresting their momentum in a cloud of grit and dust. Harper gasped, the air knocked out of her. Her ears were ringing, and the scent of ruptured coolant filled the cabin. She blinked, trying to clear her vision. The windshield was a spiderweb of cracks, but it had held. "Thorne?" she managed to croak. She turned her head and stopped. Thorne wasn't in his seat. He'd thrown himself across the center console at the moment of impact, his large frame acting as a shield over her body. His head was slumped against her shoulder, and a thick stream of blood ran from a gash on his temple, staining her gray tank top. "Thorne, wake up!" Harper reached out, her hands shaking. She pushed him back into his seat, her breath catching at the sight of his face. He was pale, his breathing shallow and ragged. She struggled with her door. It was jammed by the buckled frame. She kicked it with both feet, ignoring the flare of pain in her shoulder. On the third kick, the latch gave way, and she tumbled out into the sand. She scrambled around to the driver's side. Thorne was unconscious, pinned by the steering column. Harper didn't have her tools. She had nothing but her hands. She reached into the footwell, feeling for the release. The metal was hot, burning her fingers. She found the lever and yanked it. The seat slid back an inch, giving him room to breathe. "Come on, Thorne. Don't do this. Don't leave me here," she sobbed, pulling at his shoulders. He groaned, his eyelids fluttering. He looked up at her, his dark eyes unfocused. "Harper, you okay?" "I'm fine. You're the one who's a mess," she said, wiping the blood from his eyes with the hem of her shirt. "I told you, I don't trade what's mine," he whispered, a weak smirk touching his lips before he drifted off again. Harper looked at the wreck of the car. The beautiful machine they'd spent weeks building was a twisted heap of steel. She looked at the man who had shot her, then shielded her from certain death. She didn't feel like a prisoner anymore. She felt like a survivor. She managed to haul him out of the car and onto the sand. She sat there in the silence of the cliffside, holding his head in her lap, watching the sun dip toward the horizon. The dawn's darkness was bleeding out into the sand, and as she looked at her own grease-stained hands, she realized she was the only one who could stop it. Chapter 14. The return to the compound was a blur of siren lights and silent, grim-faced men. Thorne's lieutenant, a man named Merrick with eyes like cold flint, had found them on the cliff road. He'd looked at Harper with a suspicion that bordered on violence, but one growl from a semi-conscious Thorne had sent him back to the driver's seat of the recovery van. Now, the garage was quiet again, though the smell of the wreck lingered. Thorne was upstairs in his private quarters, being tended to by a syndicate doctor. Harper sat at her workbench, her silver bullet casing resting on a clean white cloth. She needed to know. Not the mistake version, not the protection version. She needed the truth. She walked over to the cabinet where Thorne kept his cleaning kits. She knew he had a collection of firearms in the safe behind the desk, but there was one he carried every day, the one from the photo. She found it in the top drawer of the desk, its matte finish scuffed from the crash. It was a .45 caliber semi-automatic, a custom piece with an ivory inlay on the grip. Harper picked it up. She didn't know much about guns, but she knew about mechanics. She knew about the way a firing pin left a unique mark on a primer. She knew about the way a barrel's rifling left a signature on a lead slug. She pulled a magnifying glass from her toolkit. She looked at the silver casing from her pocket, then at a spent shell she'd found in the bottom of Thorne's drawer, a practice round from the range. The firing pin strike was identical, a small, crescent-shaped indentation on the left side of the primer. Harper closed her eyes, a cold shiver running down her spine. The evidence was undeniable. Thorne hadn't just been there, he had been the one who pulled the trigger. The mistake he'd described was the truth, but the fact remained, his hand had caused the pain she carried every day. She heard the heavy door of the garage open. Merrick stepped inside, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered weapon. "Thorne wants to see you," Merrick said, his voice a low threat. "I'm busy," Harper said, not looking up from the workbench. It wasn't a request. Merrick walked toward her, his shadow stretching across the table. "You fixed the car, and it almost killed him. Some people think you did it on purpose." Harper looked up, her eyes hard. "I fixed the engine. Someone else cut the brake lines. Maybe you should look at the people who have a key to the gate, Merrick." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. For a second, the air in the garage was thick with the threat of violence. Then, he turned and gestured toward the stairs. "Go, before I change my mind about letting you walk." Harper picked up the gun and the silver casing. She tucked them both into her bag and walked toward the stairs. She was done being a mechanic. It was time to be the judge. Chapter 15. Thorne's bedroom was a stark, minimalist space, black silk, glass, and steel. He was sitting up in bed, his chest bare and wrapped in thick white bandages. The gash on his temple had been stitched, but he looked like a man who had been through a war. "Merrick said you were being difficult," Thorne said, his voice a rasping shadow of itself. Harper didn't answer. She walked to the foot of the bed and reached into her bag. She pulled out the .45 and tossed it onto the silk sheets. It landed with a heavy thud. "I checked the firing pin, Thorne," she said, her voice steady. "The casing in my pocket matches this gun. It's a perfect signature." Thorne looked at the gun, then back at Harper. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired. "I know." "You lied to me again," she said, a new wave of anger rising. "You said you were protecting the perimeter. You said it was a fluke." "It was a fluke," Thorne said, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce intensity. "I saw your father. I saw the man with the knife. I took the shot to save him because I knew he was all you had. I didn't see you until the bullet had already left the chamber. You stepped into the line of fire to stop him from running." "You shot me!" she screamed. She stepped toward the bed, her hands clenched into fists. "You took everything from me. My shop, my arm, my father. And then you brought me here and made me love you so you could feel better about it." The word love hung in the air like a live wire. Harper froze, the realization of what she'd said hitting her like a cold douse of water. Thorne reached out, his fingers catching her wrist. He didn't pull her toward him, he just held her there, his grip firm. "I didn't bring you here to feel better, Harper. I brought you here because I'm a dead man. The syndicate is falling apart. Merrick is already selling me out to the rivals. I needed that car to get you out of the city because it's the only place you'll be safe." "I don't want to be safe with you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Then go," Thorne said. He released her wrist and pushed the gun toward her across the bed. "Take it. Take the keys to Merrick's car. Go back to the wards and wait for the end. Or finish what I started 2 years ago." Harper looked at the gun. She looked at the man who had ruined her, then saved her, then tried to give her the world. She picked up the weapon, the weight of it familiar and heavy. She pointed it at his chest, right over the white bandages. Thorne didn't blink. He just watched her, his expression one of calm acceptance. "Do it, Harper. Break the darkness." The silence in the room was absolute. Harper's finger tightened on the trigger. She saw the pulse in Thorne's neck, the way his chest rose and fell with every shallow breath. She saw the man who had protected her in the sand, and the man who had fired the shot on the pier. She let out a jagged, broken sob and lowered the gun. She threw it across the room, where it shattered a glass vase on the dresser. "I'm not like you," she said, her voice a raw, bleeding thing. "I fix things. I don't destroy them." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Thorne alone in the dark. But as she reached the hallway, the sound of a distant explosion rocked the compound. The floor beneath her feet buckled, and the scream of alarms filled the air. The war had finally come to the fortress, and Harper realized she was still in the cage, and the cage was on fire. Chapter 16. The explosion at the main gate sent a tremor through the floorboards of the manor, rattling the glass shards of the broken vase in Thorne's room. Smoke, thick with the scent of burnt rubber and sulfur, began to curl through the vents. Thorne didn't reach for another weapon. He sat on the edge of the bed, his face a pale mask of exhaustion. He reached into the nightstand and pulled out a heavy ring of keys and a thick envelope. "The back elevator leads to the service tunnel," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It exits 2 miles south of the ridge. Merrick's car is in the shed. The keys are there. The envelope has enough to get you across the border." Harper stared at the keys. The alarms continued to blare, a rhythmic scream that set her teeth on edge. "Why now? You're just giving up?" "I'm not giving up, Harper. I'm giving you back the life I took." He gestured toward the door. "Go, before the rivals reach this floor. Merrick has already turned the security feeds off. You've got 5 minutes." Harper grabbed the keys. She didn't look at the envelope. She bolted from the room, her boots thudding on the plush carpet. She reached the service tunnel, a cold, damp concrete tube that smelled of mildew. She ran until her lungs burned and her bad shoulder throbbed with a dull, rhythmic heat. She reached the shed, found the car, a nondescript sedan, and sped away into the night. She drove straight to the iron wards. She needed the familiar grease and the salt air of the piers to clear her head. But when she reached the street where her shop stood, she slammed the brakes. The shop was a blackened skeleton. The roof had collapsed, and the "Vance & Son" sign lay in the gutter, charred beyond recognition. A rival gang's mark was spray-painted across the soot-stained brick. Everything was gone. Her tools, her memories, her father's old bench, all ash. She stood in the rain, the cold water soaking through her tank top. She realized then that Thorne hadn't been keeping her in a cage. He'd been keeping her in a sanctuary. The world outside didn't want her back. It didn't even remember she existed. She reached into her pocket and felt the gold coin. She'd spent her whole life trying to fix things, but for the first time, she had nothing left to mend. Chapter 17. The compound was a war zone when Harper returned. She didn't take the sedan back. She found her old primer gray Chevy C10 parked in a scrap lot near the south gate, its tailgate still hanging open just as she'd left it at the piers. Someone, likely Merrick, had towed it there as junk. She jumped into the cab. The engine turned over with a familiar, stubborn roar. She drove through the breached gate, dodging the wreckage of syndicate SUVs. She headed for the garage. It was the only place Thorne would go. Inside, the blue-white lights flickered. The smell of copper and spent powder was overwhelming. In the center of the room, near the heavy hoist, Thorne lay pinned. A massive engine block, the very one they'd worked on, had been knocked from its chains during a blast. It sat across his legs, crushing him against the concrete. Merrick stood over him, a smudge of soot on his cheek and a cold grin on his face. He held a suppressed pistol aimed at Thorne's head. "You were always too soft on the help, Thorne," Merrick said. His voice echoed off the steel beams. "The rivals offered a seat at the table for the man who brings them your head and the girl. I'll just tell them the girl died in the blast." Thorne didn't beg. He looked at the engine block, then at Merrick. "You always were a hack, Merrick. You didn't even torque the hoist chains right. That's why it fell." Merrick laughed and thumbed the safety off. "Doesn't matter now." Harper didn't scream. She didn't call out. She slammed the Chevy into gear and floored it. The truck's tires screamed against the garage floor, finding grip on the oil-slicked concrete. She aimed the grill of the C10 straight for the back of the rival SUV parked in the bay. The impact was a deafening roar of twisting metal. The SUV spun, catching Merrick in the side and tossing him like a rag doll into a stack of tires. He hit the wall and slumped down, unconscious. Harper jumped from the cab before the truck had even stopped moving. She ran to the hoist, her eyes wide. "Thorne!" Chapter 18. "You're a terrible driver," Thorne wheezed, his eyes fluttering as Harper knelt beside him. "Shut up," she snapped. She looked at the engine block. It was 1,000 pounds of dead weight. She couldn't lift it, and the hoist chains were snapped. She looked at her truck. The winch on the front bumper was still intact. She scrambled back to the Chevy, pulling the heavy steel cable from the spool. Her shoulders screamed as she hauled the hook toward the engine block. She looped it around the mounting brackets she'd machined herself. "Hold on!" she yelled. She jumped back into the cab and threw the winch into reverse. The cable went taut, humming with tension. The Chevy groaned, the back tires lifting an inch off the floor, but the engine block began to slide. Inch by inch, the weight moved off Thorne's legs. Once he was clear, she killed the engine and ran back to him. His legs were a mess of blood and torn fabric, and his breathing was a shallow, wet rattle. "I have to get you out of here," she said, her hands shaking as she checked his pulse. "No time," Thorne whispered. He pointed to a small medical kit on the wall, shattered by a stray bullet. "The regulator, the tank. I can't get air." The blast had punctured an oxygen line in the wall, and the backup tank's regulator was smashed. The glass gauge was gone, and the needle was bent into a useless hook. Thorne's face was turning a sickly shade of gray. Harper looked at the regulator. It was a mechanical valve, not much different from a fuel sink. She grabbed a pair of needle-nose pliers from her back pocket. "I can fix this." "Harper." "I said shut up! I'm the mechanic here." She ignored the sounds of gunfire outside. She focused on the brass valve. She stripped a piece of rubber tubing from a nearby air hose and used it to bypass the broken gauge. She jammed a flathead screwdriver into the valve to force the flow. A hiss of pure oxygen filled the air. She pressed the mask to Thorne's face. He took a long, shuddering breath, his chest rising for the first time in minutes. The gray faded from his skin, replaced by a flush of life. Chapter 19. The sounds of the battle were drawing closer. The rivals had realized Merrick failed, and they were coming to finish the job. Harper dragged Thorne toward the back of the garage, propping him up against the wall behind the heavy steel workbench. "The garage door," Thorne gasped, pointing to the main bay. "The tracks. They're jammed." Harper looked at the massive steel door. The impact of her truck had knocked the rollers out of alignment. If she couldn't close it, they were sitting ducks. She grabbed her 12mm wrench, the one she'd carried since the piers. She ran to the track. The metal was twisted, a jagged tooth of steel blocking the path. She hammered at it, but the wrench just bounced off. She needed leverage. She looked at the silver bullet casing in her pocket. She pulled it out and jammed it into the gap in the track, using it as a shim to guide the roller back into place. She threw her entire weight against the door lever. The rollers groaned. The metal screamed. With a final, violent jerk, the door slid down, the heavy bolts slamming into the floor. The garage was sealed. She walked back to Thorne, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They were trapped, but they were safe, for now. "Why did you come back?" Thorne asked. He reached out, his hand shaking, and caught her fingers. Harper looked at the grease on her hands, then at the man who had shot her. "Because you were right. You can't stand to see something broken stay that way, and you're the biggest wreck I've ever seen." Thorne laughed, a weak, wet sound. He pulled her down until she was sitting beside him. In the dim light of the flickering fluorescence, the silence felt like a gift. "I'm sorry, Harper," he whispered, "for the pier, for the lie." "Don't," she said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "The debt is paid, Thorne, in blood and grease. We're even." Chapter 20. The rivals didn't use a ram this time. They used fire. They poured gasoline under the door, the amber liquid creeping across the concrete like a hungry snake. A single match turned the entrance into a wall of flame. "They're going to smoke us out," Thorne said, reaching for the pistol Harper had tossed near him earlier. "Let them try," Harper said. She stood up, her eyes scanning the garage. She found a canister of pressurized degreaser and a roll of industrial tape. She fashioned a crude incendiary, her hands moving with a calm, terrifying speed. The door began to buckle under the heat. The first rival stepped through the flames, his face masked by a bandana. Thorne fired once, a clean shot that took the man in the shoulder. Then the rest came. The garage turned into a blur of noise and heat. Harper didn't use a gun. She used the environment. She triggered the overhead fire suppression system, a cloud of white foam dousing the flames and blinding the attackers. She moved through the mist like a ghost, using her wrench to disable anyone who got too close. Thorne provided cover from the floor, his shots rhythmic and precise. He was a Dawn again, a dealer of order in a world of chaos. When the last of the rivals retreated into the night, the garage was a ruin. The foam covered everything like a layer of fake snow. The smell of fire was gone, replaced by the sharp, chemical scent of the suppressant. Harper stood in the center of the room, her chest heaving. She looked at Merrick, who was still pinned under the tires. He was awake now, watching her with wide, terrified eyes. "Do it," Merrick hissed. "Finish it." Harper walked to him. She looked at the man who had betrayed his own for a seat at a table that didn't exist. She looked at the 12mm wrench in her hand. She could end it. She could crush his skull and call it justice. She looked at Thorne. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. He didn't tell her what to do. He left the choice to her. Harper knelt down. She didn't raise the wrench. She reached into Merrick's pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed the emergency services. "There's a man injured at the Vane compound," she said into the receiver. "Send an ambulance. And the police." She stood up and walked back to Thorne. "You're letting him live?" Thorne asked. "I'm a mechanic, Thorne," Harper said, her voice firm. "I fix things. Destruction is easy. Healing is the hard part." Chapter 21. 3 months later, the salt air of the Drowned Piers felt different. The rot was gone, replaced by the scent of fresh paint and new lumber. The "Vance & Son" sign had been replaced. The new one was made of polished steel and read, "Vance & Vane, Restorations." Thorne walked with a cane now, the limp a permanent part of his gait. He wore a simple black t-shirt and jeans, his days of charcoal suits and gold coins behind him. He spent his afternoons in the front office, handling the books and the clients who wanted their ghosts brought back to life. Harper was under a car, a 1970 Jensen Interceptor, identical to the one they'd lost on the cliff. This one was pristine, a gift Thorne had tracked down from a private collector in the north. She slid out from under the chassis on a creeper, a streak of oil across her forehead. "The fuel sink is humming, Thorne. She's ready for the test drive." Thorne smiled, a genuine, easy look that reached his eyes. "You take her. I've had enough cliffside views for one lifetime." Harper wiped her hands on a rag. She looked at her left shoulder. The range of motion wasn't perfect, and it still ached when the rain came, but she didn't mind. The scar was no longer a reminder of a bullet. It was a map of how far she'd come. She looked at Thorne. They hadn't talked about the future, or the syndicate, or the man who had shot her. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of everything they'd built together. "We're going to the iron wards first," Harper said, tossing him a set of keys. "I want to show the boys what a real engine sounds like." "Lead the way, Wrench," Thorne said. They drove out of the shop together, the engine of the Jensen a deep, guttural roar that echoed off the water. The piers were still foggy, and the world was still full of broken things, but as the sun broke through the mist, Harper realized that some things were worth the effort of mending. The dawn's darkness was gone, broken not by a bullet, but by the girl who knew that even the most shattered heart could be fixed if you just had the right tools and enough time. The road ahead was open, and for the first time in her life, Harper Vance didn't feel the need to look back. She had the gun, she had the motive, but Harper chose the wrench over the bullet. Would you have pulled the trigger on Thorne after a betrayal like that? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I want to know if you are Team Revenge or Team Redemption. If this story got your pulse racing, smash that like button and make sure you are subscribed to @Lizzy Mafia Romance Stories with the notification bell turned on. The Syndicate War is just getting started, and you do not want to miss our next upload. Click the video on your screen for another intense, high-stakes romance, and I'll see you in the next one.